So welcome to our book talk this afternoon, Teaching Peace as a Matter of Justice, authored by Dale Snauwaert, published by Cambridge Scholars Publishing in July 2023. So firstly, a big congratulations to our author on this wonderful scholarship, which explores the normative dimensions of peace studies and peace education through the lens of a moral and political philosophy. The purpose of the book is to explore the idea of peace as a matter of justice and to articulate a pedagogical framework for the development and exercise of citizens' capacities for moral reasoning and judgment regarding the potential responses to the basic questions of justice, including resisting injustice. Dale Snauwaert is a professor of educational philosophy and peace studies and director of the Graduate Certificate in the Foundations of Peace Education and undergraduate minor in Peace Studies at the University of Toledo. He is the founding editor of Factus Pax, an online journal of peace education and social justice. His core interests include the philosophies of peace, democracy, and human rights education. He is the co-author of Human Rights Education Beyond Universalism and Relativism, and co-author with Janet Gerson, also joining us today, of Reclamative Post-Conflict Justice, Democratizing Justice in the World Tribunal on Iraq, and also the editor of the 2 volumes of Betty Reardon's work, Betty A. Reardon, A Pioneer in Peace for Peace and Human Rights, and Betty A. Reardon, Key Text in Gender and Peace, as well as exploring Betty A. Reardon's perspective on peace education. Joining us is Dr. Snauwaert in discussion with his and teachers alumni, Dr. Janet, Director of the International Institute on Peace Education. Okay. Over to Dale.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I think there's a feedback. Could everyone mute their mic? I think it might be you, Lou. If you can mute. Okay. That seems to have worked. Thank you. Jennifer, thank you for that generous introduction and for hosting us today. Really appreciate it. Thank you to Teachers College as well for offering this opportunity. Thank you to Janet Gerson for her commentary today and her participation. I really appreciate it. I'd also like to acknowledge my wife, Mary, who's with us today, and thank her for all the help she gave me and support in doing the book. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Mary. And also to Betty Reardon, who was able, with the assistance of Janet, to write a foreword to the book. And as many of you know, Betty passed away a few months ago, and we miss her, but I wanted to acknowledge her contribution to the book as well. And thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate your spending your time this afternoon on this topic and your energy as well. So the plan for today is I will offer a brief summary outline of the book, maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And then I will turn it over to Dr. Gerson for commentary. She has some comments to share And after that, we will open up the forum to general questions from all of you and comments as well. So again, thank you for being here. So as Jennifer noted, the purpose of the book is to articulate a philosophical and pedagogical framework for teaching peace as a matter of justice. The work of the book is situated within the normative dimension of the field of peace and justice studies. As you well know, peace studies is interdisciplinary. And as such, inquiry, it has at least 4 dimensions to it. Inquiry into the causes of violence and its consequences, a study of the methods of resolving and transforming conflict, as well as peace building, and the articulation and justification of moral principles, values, and institutions of peace on multiple levels of society. And those areas define the substantive focus of peace studies. So the work is situated within the latter dimension, the normative dimension of peace studies. I can begin with some basic assumptions that inform the work. First, peace, as indicated by the title of the book, peace is a matter of justice, a basic assumption that peace is not merely the absence of violence, but it also more positively is the presence of justice. And for a variety of reasons, we have a higher order, or perhaps highest order interest in establishing and sustaining a just society. The second assumption is that the presence of justice is in part contingent upon the informed political participation of citizens, conceived as not the mere recipients of justice, but as dynamic agents of justice. And therefore, one could also think of this work as offering a conception of democratic education, the education of democratic citizens. The third assumption is that citizens must be reconciled with their society and world by understanding and affirming the principles of a justifiable conception of justice, a conception of justice formed from public deliberation and reasoning. Fourth assumption is that an essential aspect of citizens' capability to participate is their capacity of moral reasoning and judgment. And this capacity cannot be transmitted per se, but only can be developed through exercise and practice. The sixth assumption is that a conception of justice refers to a set of normative principles that define what is right, including rights and duties. The seventh assumption is that in considering justice, therefore, we need to explore possible principles of justice. And eighth, that justice is in turn contextual and multidimensional, in the sense that there is a plurality of basic questions of justice that every society must answer through processes of public deliberation and the exercise of public reason. These basic questions include the question of whose security, who should have an equal right to security of person, and how is security to be conceived? For example, should we conceive it in terms of a national security or alternatively human security? The second basic question is who belongs, which is a question of membership. Who should be considered an equal citizen and thus a full participant in the society? Thirdly, whose truth? What conception of truth and thereby reality should be affirmed in the society? And fundamentally, what is the valid basis of determining the truth? The fourth basic question is who gets what? This is a question of distributive justice. How should the basic goods and resources of a society be distributed? What would constitute a fair distribution of those goods? The fifth basic question is who decides? Who should have political decision-making authority? And what constitutes a just distribution of political power? And finally, this sixth question of justice that I have identified is whose resistance? Is there a right and duty to or duty to resist and redress injustice? And if so, what principles of corrective justice should guide that resistance? And who should bear this duty to resist? The answers to these questions take the form of principles that can comprise a multidimensional conception of justice. Furthermore, however, we need to not only consider and identify principles of justice, but we also must identify the criteria or standards of validity upon which we can assess their justifiability. We can and should ask whether the principles of justice and the judgments concerning laws, policies, and practices based upon them are morally justifiable and thus legitimate. What reasons can be offered to justify the normative validity of principles of justice and valid judgment as the application of justifiable principles to cases and matters of justice? That's the question that follows, and it's one of the basic questions of this work. As the philosopher Thomas Scanlon suggests, following Scanlon, he writes, thinking, and I quote, thinking about right and wrong is at the basic level, thinking about what we could justify to others on grounds that they, if appropriately motivated, could not reasonably reject, end quote. Based upon a review of the historical contours of moral thought, I argue that that normative justification cannot rest on either the two basic paradigms of justification that have been historically dominant. Those two are an appeal to the cognition of moral truths or facts, nor through mere social acceptance. Given the social fact of pluralism, there is no rational basis for intersubjective agreement concerning the existence of a common moral truth. That is an independent moral order across all philosophical and religious traditions. Furthermore, the interpretation of any moral truth claim requires some independent standard or criterion. Furthermore, there's a basic distinction between social acceptance and justified acceptability. A principle may be widely shared, but it may be nevertheless unjustifiable. And there are many historical examples of that occurring. For example, human slavery was once widely there was a widely shared belief that human slavery, as you well know, was morally justifiable. And there are many instances of principles and norms and customs that have been widely shared, but turn out upon further scrutiny to be unjustifiable. Therefore, I conclude that principles require a basis of justification that is independent of social custom as such. And if we reject both an appeal to moral truth and an appeal solely to social acceptance, what would be an alternative? And in the book, I argue that we can appeal to an idea of moral reasoning as a foundation for normative justification. And again, I quote Scanlon, who writes, if we could characterize the method of reasoning through which we arrive at judgments of right and wrong, and could explain why there is a good reason to give judgments arrived at in this way the kind of importance that moral judgments are normally thought to have, then we would, I believe, have given sufficient answer to the question of the subject matter of right and wrong, end quote. As Scanlon suggests, along with many others, one option is to look to the nature of moral reasoning itself for the criteria of justification. The attempt here is to identify normative reasons for the justified acceptability of principles of justice. The claim that a principle and judgment based upon it is normatively right presupposes that we have reason to affirm it. And that reason is not any reason as such, but a justifiable reason. So we can ask, what normative reasons could we appeal to justify principles of justice? And in turn, what justifiable principles can we apply to particular matters of justice? And in this regard, I appeal to one option as the idea of fairness. And this, the idea of justice as fairness, and that is originated by the philosopher John Rawls. And here I quote from Amartya Sen, a noted philosopher in his own right, that in his book, The Idea of Justice, Sen writes, perhaps the most far-reaching example of what is essential for an adequate understanding of justice is Rawls's foundational idea that justice has to be seen in terms of the demands of fairness. I would argue that we have good reason to be persuaded by Rawls that the pursuit of justice has to be linked and in some sense derived from the idea of fairness. This central understanding is deeply relevant to most analyses of justice, end quote. So following Sen, I appeal in the process of moral reasoning, I suggest that we can appeal to the elements of fairness understood as presuppositions that constitute the criteria of moral reasoning and therefore normative justification. As such, the elements of fairness act as constraints or restrictions on what principles can be accepted as justifiable. These elements, there are four basic elements that I have been identified of fairness. One is equality. We can ask, in considering the justifiability of a principle, does the principle recognize and treat all persons as equals? Secondly, the second element is recognition. Is it consistent with respect for persons and their self-realization? Thirdly is the element of reciprocity. Does the principle apply to all affected, avoiding claiming for oneself what one denies to others? Is it acceptable to all? Does any reasonable person have a valid reason to reject it? And the fourth element of fairness is impartiality. Is it biased? Is the principle biased in favor of one's self-interest? Does it unfairly favor anyone? Or in other words, does it serve the common good? Is the principle of mutual benefit? From this perspective, justification rests upon consistency or coherence between the elements of fairness and principles of justice upon due reflection, what John Rawls called reflective equilibrium. And in turn, consistency between our justified principles and judgments regarding particular matters of justice. So this is a summary of the basic idea of moral reasoning that I put forth in the book. And given this conception of moral reasoning and justification, I turn to the to a pedagogical approach to teaching peace as a matter of justice based upon that conception of moral reasoning, and attempt a framework toward a pedagogy of moral reasoning. So pedagogically, first of all, my approach is informed by the conception of a process-oriented, reflective, inquiry-based, dialogical pedagogy as articulated by John Dewey, Paulo Freire, and Betty Reardon, whose primary focus is not only on understanding, but importantly, the development of the critical thinking capacities of students. From this perspective, the development of citizens' moral reasoning and judgment capacity requires a pedagogical process that exercises their moral reasoning and judgment capacities. That is a pedagogy of moral reasoning. It is assumed that these capacities cannot be transmitted to the student, but can only be developed through exercise and practice. Furthermore, I employ the idea of the logical structure of the subject matter as the teaching focus developed by Jerome Bruner and John Dewey, among others, which also frames the pedagogical approach. The logical structure of a discipline is comprised of the subject matter's fundamental ideas and methods of inquiry. So we could ask from this perspective, what are the fundamental ideas of justice? What method of moral reason and judgment can be pedagogically employed in teaching peace as a matter of justice? And my answer is that the fundamental ideas in here are the principled answers to the 6 basic questions of justice. And the method of inquiry is the process of moral reasoning and judgment that I outlined earlier. That's the foundational basis of the pedagogy that I put forth in the book. And that approach is structured. I structured that approach, that pedagogical approach, in terms of what I call the Peace Constitution Project. A constitution is a charter of principles of justice and their supporting reasons of justification in terms of fairness. A constitution, a charter, is a declaration of what a just society should be in principle. The justifiable answers to the basic questions of justice in the form of principles of justice comprise the fabric of a peace constitution. So in considering the elements of a peace constitution, I have students, and this is framed in the book, the idea that students are asked to justify their choice of principles from within the moral point of view of fairness. And the project is to engage students in deliberation and reasoning to construct a constitution of a just and peaceful society, which is comprised of basic principles of justice, by engaging students in inquiry into the basic questions of justice. So in this project, in this pedagogical project, I argue that, and I've employed this in my own teaching, undergraduate teaching in the Introduction to Peace and Justice Studies course, that I have students, work in groups, working in groups, ask students to, first of all, summarize the basic question of justice under consideration and to summarize each basic question. And then I have them discuss the alternative principles of justice, including rights and duties, that are possible answers to the basic question, and to deliberate and choose a set of principles in response to that question. In the book, I provide a discussion of prominent alternative principles for each basic question of justice, but it is not exhaustive only suggestive. And I'm just providing possible alternatives for the students to think about and to deliberate upon. And then they are, after a choice, not only are they asked to deliberate and choose a set of principles, but they are also asked to articulate a justification of those principles by reflecting and debating about the consistency between their chosen principles and the elements of fairness. So I have them, and I recommend in the book that they, from the moral point of view of fairness, ask the basic question: are these principles justifiable? Does it recognize and treat all persons as equals? Is it consistent with respect for persons? Does it apply to all affected? Does anyone have a reason to reject it? Does it unfairly favor anyone? Does it serve the common good? So the Peace Constitution Project is an attempt to operationalize a pedagogy of moral reasoning, and thereby to define a method, a pedagogical method for teaching peace as a matter of justice. And this Peace Constitution Project is designed as a pedagogical means that will exercise and practice and thereby develop the moral reasoning capacities of students. It operationalizes the exercise of moral reasoning as a process of deliberation and normative justification of principles of justice, and therefore is a means of teaching peace as a matter of justice. The book provides a philosophical and pedagogical framework for this process. So, a brief summary. There's much more detail in the book if you're inclined to follow this up. So thank you for listening, and I'll turn it over to Janet.
Thank you, Dale, for that fine, enlightening, illuminating, and intense description of your book. I think my role in part is to dumb it down a little bit and ask you for a few questions. So I've had the privilege since 1996 when I met Dale in Betty's class to follow Dale's thinking and development and grow myself in dialogue and observation of Dale's project to work through the concepts of democracy, justice, and moral reasoning and how they're related to peace, because all of these concepts can be so abstract or so dumbed down to just, is that true or false, to an opinion. Oh, that's right, that's wrong, I like this, I don't like this. And I think the book offers an elaborate mapping, a process, step-by-step process of considering how to think and to be active in the social political participation of moral reasoning and thinking about democracy, peace, and justice, and as well as education. So in Betty's class, it was called The Human Social Dimensions of Peace. And the topic was to form an ethical framework for a planetary society. And she might as well have tossed us into the middle of New York Harbor and told us to swim, because we didn't know what we were doing. But it was a really fantastic and visionary project, which I think Dale brings to not a conclusion, but to a culmination, which he has really developed in the process of working with his students on the bachelor's, master's, and PhD and some of us postdoctoral levels. And so I think it's an extremely useful book as a textbook, because people so often don't really understand these concepts. And I want to point out that when I ask students or audiences, what does justice mean to you? They have very simplistic, often very simplistic responses. And they may think that justice is bad or good, law is bad or good. But I think the whole point of teaching peace as moral reasoning is that it teaches you to take the problem, the challenge, and inquire into it, form questions. As you can see from Dale's explanation, he's formed a series of questions that structure, as opposed to simply content, that structure the inquiry and structure and give focus to the debate that can be set up against other criteria, like, is everyone equal in this discussion, etc. Recognition, reciprocity, and does it meet the demands of fairness? So I want to say that I think the skills of writing, because in the UN, Betty was helping to write documents that were used by global civil society and activists and leaders to deliberate on the problems of world peace. And it seems to me that it would be so useful for our American society and democracy for all students to be educated in the process of writing, formulating and writing such documents. Because why not? Because the point of being peace activists and learners working for justice in a democratic society requires the education of forming questions, processing the input, and I'm going very short here just to make this one point, to how to process and then articulate together what can be put forward. So one last point, that justice is often very simplistically understood, as I said before, but I think Dale's questions, 6 questions, open it up to a holistic and complementary perspective. So much of our time is spent arguing about which kind of justice should prevail, should dominate. And Dale proposes that it's an array, a holistic perspective. And then, although we always talk about peace being holistic, what is that? Peace being comprehensive, parts of the problem of peace being complementary. I think Dale's book and Dale's explanation offer a process and a pedagogy and a practice for jumping in and experiencing it for yourself. Okay, I just have 3. I think that Dale offers paradigm shifts in the understanding of peace, the understanding of justice, and the understanding of education. With regard to peace, he's asking us to not leave the question of violence, but move to a perspective of the presence of justice. I'll just say these 3, Dale, and then I'll give it to you. Should I do that? Yes, okay. In justice, as I said before, people say, no, it's economic justice. No, it's political justice, etc. No, it's retributive, vengeful, or restorative. Dale offers an array, which is a very different perspective. And with education, you focus on not the didactic, not the facts and the figures and the dates, but thinking, education for thinking, and educating for moral reasoning, which is a social foundation for building a moral and ethical society in which peace can exist. So you seem to, for me, you switch paradigms on all of those and shift in a beautiful way. Do you want to add anything more to that before? And then we'll go to questions from you, the audience.
Well, thank you, Janet. That was really, really generous and kind, and insightful. I'm not sure if I understand it as a paradigm shift, but I like the sound of that. But I think thinking about justice is central to our pursuit of a more peaceful world, and all of that is contingent, in my view, upon citizens being educated in a way that develops their capacity to reason and to exercise judgment in reasonable ways, and to think about justice in a more formal or a more principled manner. So, thank you, Jenna.
Thank you, Dale. Now he made simple what I said, which is a good example of what we have to do in education. Thank you. So I invite you to, you can raise your hand to ask a question. And, you know, it could be a clarification question. It could be process or understanding question. It could be an example from your experience.
Or any comment would be welcome as well.
Yes, you could express your appreciation in different ways, your insights.
Or any critical analysis is also welcome.
Yes, Matis.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm very impressed by this. I think that the comprehensiveness is really amazing, and I think it's also what's also I think amazing is the sheer ambition behind this. So I definitely want to read your book. One of the things I'm wondering about, and you probably had this question before, is to what extent is the framework that you're presenting here something that applies to all nations, all cultures, and to what extent is it viewed as what you could call like culturally relative? Or is it like the relativity is in how the constructs are operationalized, not in the constructs themselves?
It's a great question, Matt, and it's great to see you. I didn't recognize you earlier, but it's
Likewise.
been too long. It's been too long. Matt and I are former colleagues at Delphi University, and I haven't seen Matt in many years. So great to see you. Thank you for your question. Well, I'm coming from a particular cultural point of view, I guess, and that's a democratic point of view. So I think my analysis and my philosophical framework and my pedagogical approach probably works best in the context of a democratic society. And in particular, in the back of my mind as I was developing and writing the book, I was mainly thinking of the United States and its citizenry first and foremost. But I believe it also applies to other democratic societies as well. So that's a simplistic answer to your question, man. So I don't claim any kind of universal perspective here. I think it applies within a democratic context and within a possible democratic culture.
Thank you. Someone else? I may have to invite someone to say something. So in the chat, I appreciate from Brian Wright, I appreciate the shift towards justice through the lens of moral reasoning. If
Yes.
If we may think of justice as in the eyes of the other, do we reason together with commitment to justice for all?
That's Brian, that's a great question. And I would say yes. When we think about justice, we are necessarily thinking about our relationship to others. Our conception of justice, our normative conceptions are addressed to others. They're not confined to ourselves. So our perspective is the perspective of others, and what would define a right relationship with others. And therefore, we have to reason together. Definitely, we have to reason together from the perspective of fairness, perhaps, or another perspective that may be equally or more appealing. But that's reflected in my advocacy of the Peace Constitution Project as a pedagogical approach, that the students are actually reasoning together with a commitment to the possibility of defining what a just society may be, and that's really the core of the idea, is that we have to reason, we have to deliberate together in the spirit of fairness, and to respect each other as we deliberate. And that does include reasonable disagreement. We don't have to, there is the possibility that we will disagree. And so within the project, the pedagogical project, I allow or I advocate that there can be dissenting opinions. And in my experience of using this, students do articulate dissenting points of view in the Constitution, in the Charter, and that's fantastic when they do so. So it's definitely in the spirit of public deliberation and public reasoning. That is, and therefore it is essentially, in my view, a democratic process. So thank you for your question.
You wanna
May I
respond?
follow up for a moment?
Please.
Thanks, Dale. I appreciate that elaboration. I think that any of our engagement must always be with the other, but in the way that we choose to frame and hold other in our world today, particularly in light of current conflict and current violent conflict around our world, sometimes I think that the issue of moral reasoning sits in its own space, and we are individuals or groups may be reluctant to enter into that space. And it's difficult for many. And even to the point that I think that there can be such a thing that there might give rise to a moral injury that individuals may feel or understand or experience because they are encouraged or expected to enter into a realm of moral reasoning to resolve matters of history, time, space that we and individual cultures face. I know you framed this from your democratic perspective, but I'm really pulling it out of that and saying, how do we live in this world of 8 billion humans today beyond the democratic frame to get into the universe of moral reasoning?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. complex question. I write in the book that around the question of who belongs, I discuss our tribal tendencies, our very strong social psychological tendencies to be tribal in our orientations, and that in-group bias and out-group hostility can be very easily triggered, as social psychologists have demonstrated. So we seem to be wired, if you will, as human beings to be tribal in a sense. And the question, and that if we stay in that tribal orientation, then that leads to all kinds of injustice and violence between groups, as history demonstrates. The question is, can we transcend our tribalism? Can we transcend our in-group bias and our out-group hostility and recognize the other, as even the alien other, as a human being with an equal inherent dignity to our own? And one possibility is the affirmation of and thinking through principles that would apply to others, and thinking through that would the other person have reason to reject what I am suggesting, and thereby responding to the call of the other in our thinking, at least. So that's my hope, at least, that through the cultivation, through the practice, exercise of reasoning together, that we could transcend our tribalism and begin to recognize in each other as equals, and to treat each other in a fair and just manner. Whether I'm right about that, I don't know. Yeah, but that's my proposition, if you would.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Adam, you have a question? There's another question in the chat too we'd like to get to after Adam's.
Yes, thank you, Janet. Forgive me for bringing a note of gloom or despair to the proceedings, but I just wanted to ask, how do we not despair as citizens in Western democracies when we see our governments taking the positions that they are? I know we're speaking sort of at 30,000 feet, but when I'm thinking specifically about what's happening in Gaza, I've been thinking a lot about the R2P, responsibility to protect, which is something we often discuss in academic settings. But if this is an opportunity or the instant where it should be implemented in a practical sense, or with intervention, then I don't know what is. So perhaps you could speak to that, Dale.
Well, that's a difficult question, Adam. My hope is that I view governments as rational actors, in the sense that governments pursue their perceived interests, and the officials that comprise the government are acting out of self-interest as well. And governments tend not, perhaps even are not capable of being reasonable. That is, acting in the interest of justice. So if that's a valid characterization of government, and their use of coercive power to pursue those interests, then what is left is for the citizens to hold the government accountable, and to pressure the government in a political sense to act, to regulate their actions in terms of justice, in terms of what is reasonable. So I think it's up to us to to counter, to balance the power, if you will, between government and society made up of us, to counter the authoritarian tendencies, really, of all governments. The hope of democracy is that citizens would be educated enough and have the capacities, understanding and capacities to hold, to be reasonable and to hold the government accountable in terms of justice, and to pressure them, government officials, to act in terms of justice. That's my basic answer to your question. I'm not sure if it's adequate, but that's how I think of it. That there is, we have a responsibility, I believe, as citizens to act and to participate in a way that holds that can regulate the actions of governments and to hold them accountable. But in order to do that, we need to, as citizens, understand what justice is, what principles of justice are justifiable, and be able to enter into that kind of discourse. And we can only do that through a particular kind of education. And that's where peace education comes in, democratic education comes in. Without which, and we have failed in that way. Our schools are not centers of moral reasoning or empowerment or developing critical thinking or understandings of justice. But thank you, Adam, for that question.
Oops. Okay. So Dale, thank you for that. And I think we have 5 minutes left, and I think we have 2 questions. Here, one from Audrey Bryan. Dale, I'm reading from the chat. Dale, these essential questions of justice and moral reasoning are so vital. Can you say more about how the pedagogical process plays out and is experienced in the classroom? I'm especially interested in how emotion intersects with moral reasoning in the real world classrooms. And Dale, would you like the other question too? Because we have time for one response. Yeah. So, Lynn Hammer, hello. In the same vein, she says, have you had memorable moments in your teaching when students have transcended tribal tendencies, or when the dialogue has become difficult due to those tribal tendencies surfacing? Or are there moments when things fall apart? What do you do then? I am imagining that these moments might have pushed the development of your framework in interesting ways. Wonderful book, wonderful talk, wonderful contribution. Thank you.
Well, thank you both to Audrey and Lynn. Good to see you both. Audrey's question, I think from my perspective, moral sentiments are, moral emotions are very important dimension of a sense of justice and the development of a sense of justice, and that they refer to a moral psychology, or the moral psychology of reasoning, or a moral psychology of a sense of justice, and that those sentiments on a feeling level need to be cultivated in students as well, as in particular, so they are motivated to be just. And that's a huge question, of course, a huge question of moral psychology. What motivates us? What can motivate us to seek justice? What motivates us to pursue justice in relation to others? And that speaks to our moral psychology and our and the development of moral sentiments. So that's a very important aspect of peace education that goes beyond what I've attempted in my short book here, but it's very important as well. To Lynn's question, yes, I have encountered a number of moments in teaching, both transcending possibilities or indications that students begin to think in terms of principles that transcend their own identity, really, their own cultural identity. And the class is very diverse, usually, a diverse representation of persons. Also, I have experienced difficulties as well in terms of clashes of identity between students and how their cultural identities, and including religious identities, have influenced their thinking about what would be an acceptable principles of justice. So, and that's a source, usually a source of disagreement between them, among other moments. So it's I've done the Constitution Project twice so far, and they've produced some interesting charters and interesting thinking. But I will keep an eye out for those kinds of issues, which I think are very important and are inevitable to emerge among students, a diverse group of students in a classroom, and that's all good. That's all good. Thank you for that. I have in the chat, I put some information about the book. If you're interested in purchasing a hard copy, you can do so at a discount. Use the promo code. Also, I have a PDF. If you'd like to download a PDF of the book for free, you can follow that link. And if you're affiliated with the university library, please ask your library to order the book as well. I think we've reached the 5 o'clock hour. Thank you all for coming today, and I appreciate your attention and your insight. I really appreciate you being here, and thank you to Jennifer and Janet and Teachers College again for hosting. And thank you, Janet, for your insightful comments. Appreciate it. And thank you all for your questions.
It's just a great pleasure to work with you, know you follow the deep thinking and development you've made, and I appreciate it. And thanks to Jennifer also, and everyone for being here. Good to see you all.
Thank you again. Hopefully this conversation will continue, and we're ever grateful for sharing your work.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Okay.